Welcome to Sensibly Cynical. My name is Sean, and today I have a very special episode lined up. I will go over the backstory of how this podcast started, and then I will also tell you guys why I still podcast. So this should be fun, and I'm ready to spill the beans. I have my cranberry juice here, so I'm ready to go. Okay, I've listened to podcasts for a very long time, and as you probably have come to realize, especially with Sugar and Ashley Nolan, that I am a very big Survivor fan. So in about 2012, I started listening to Rob Has a Podcast, which is hosted by Rob Cesternino, and he is a former Survivor castaway, and he's become a podcast legend. He's won multiple awards. And I just got enamored with the podcasting world. I started listening to Chris Jericho's podcast not too long ago. And of course, the big ones, CNN releases podcasts and CBS and, things like that. And I kept wanting more and more and more. And I've now dedicated hours of my downtime to catching up on podcasts. It's kind of an obsession, and I love it. I know that eventually the podcasting world is going to come to an end. Everything comes to an end. This podcast will come to an end, probably sooner rather than later, but who knows? So fast forward to 2017 when I moved to Pensacola, Florida. That's where we're based out of right now, Pensacola, which is in the panhandle of the state, home of Roman Reigns, and home of Emmitt Smith and people like that. So stars, there's a lot of stars that are in Pensacola. They just hide out, hit or miss. So when I got here, it was hard to meet people. I've been on a couple events through the application meetup and met Frank Jack. He was a former co-host with me on here. There's a whole backlog of episodes that you can go check out. The very beginning of the podcast, man, was it rough. We did episodes out of a car, and in the audio for the first, 20 episodes are average at best. I'm actually surprised that we made it out of that stage. And it all comes from my passion for podcasting. And I really love doing this podcast. And, I need an upgrade on equipment if I'm going to continue this, which is why I started a patron page for this show. If you become a patron of Sensibly Cynical, you will see a huge improvement of this podcast. I will use the money for better equipment, for an actual studio, and the opportunities will be endless. I will be able to possibly pay an audio engineer, because even now I think our audio is sketchy. So it would really, really, really be helpful if you decide to become a patron of this show. You can check out our patron page, www.patreon.com/Sensibly Cynical. That's patreon.com/Sensibly Cynical. And you can sign up today. We have 2 tiers, Sensible and Cynical. And, I have a lot of benefits ready to go. So you'll definitely get a huge return. And the tiers are at a good price point. So for me to take this podcast to the next level and continue doing this for the next, handful of years, things need to improve. I understand that. I'm not perfect. No one's perfect. But this comes from a deep-seated passion to do this. I love podcasting. I love interviewing. Hopefully you have enjoyed the content that I put out for the last couple years. I enjoyed hosting with Frank. I wish he would still host, but it is what it is. Okay, back to 2017. Frank thought of the name. We were, contemplating a bunch of different names and, cynicism, things that were skeptical, sensible, terms. And then one night he's just like, Sensibly Cynical. And I was like, oh my God, that's it. That is the name. And he wanted red and black, so that's what I did. I made the logo with logo maker that I still use today. And voila, you have Sensibly Cynical. Now the guests that we have landed have been amazing. And it's just me reaching out. I just say, hey, listen, here's our website, here's our podcast library. And I would be highly appreciative if you would consider being a guest on the show. And that pitch has worked. We've had some amazing guests. Jessica Sugar Kuiper, the stripper comedian, Christy Monroe, Ashley Nolan, Dina Janelle. The list goes on, all because I just asked. Unless you ask, it's always going to be no. The key word there was I. I love doing the podcast with Frank. Frank and I had a blast. True, we'd fight a lot, and the conversation would just be up and down, but I think there's some funny moments. I mean, I would go check out the porn talk for sure. I think that's our best episode. So is the one that we talk about paranormal activity, hoodoo, voodoo, all that fun stuff, cryptozoology. He trolled me on that. But the key word was I. I talked to people. I messaged people. I promoted the show. I'm not saying that, it was just me, but I did the promoting. So I'm used to it now. It prepped me to run this solo. And, the future is bright. The future is bright for this podcast. I feel like if I get some new equipment, if I improve our audio, if I get some, activity when it comes to patrons, this podcast can go to heights unforeseen, unseen, and I'm so excited for the future. I just would like to have, some help in getting the new podcast equipment and things like that. Okay, so let's continue with the story. So our last podcast together was actually the Sugar podcast on June 29th, 2019. I remember Jessica Sugar Kuiper from Survivor. She was on Survivor Gabon, and she was recruited, obviously. She was an actress, and she was in Weeds. She did, like I said, pinup modeling. You can go check out our interview with her. It was a thrill for me. I'm a huge fan of Sugar. I'm a huge fan of her work. And did I know that was going to be Frank and I's last podcast together? No. But if there's an episode to end it on, that was it. And I thought about stopping. I really did. I thought, what better episode to end the series than with Jessica Sugar Kuiper, the biggest celebrity we've had on the show. But like I said earlier, I have a passion for this. And I didn't want to stop. I just didn't. I thought maybe if I run this by myself, I could take this to places that we didn't get to together. And I'm right. I mean, we have more downloads than we've ever had. The interaction on Instagram has really been a boost for the show, and it's all credit to Frank as well, because Frank drew an audience that I didn't. He had wit. He knows economics. He knows things that I didn't know. And that's what was the intrigue behind the show, was that we balance each other out. He's, far right. I'm in the middle, I'm Republican, but I'm, right in the middle there. So we had a nice balance. True, we fought a lot. And, I'm sure you guys have noticed or did notice that we differed quite a bit when it comes to how the podcast was ran, when it came to what to talk about. A lot of it was off the cuff, explicit stuff, and things that I'm not doing nowadays. I'm cutting back on the language. I don't know if you've noticed that, but I've really toned down the language. The last podcast I really was explicit in was the hot takes, and that's it. I mean, I'm still going to curse every once in a while, but this is going to be, more serious now. I'm not going to go on crazy rants other than the dramatic rant that I'll do semi-annually. But my point is, I'm not going to go on curse-filled diatribes, So that's where we're at with the podcast. I've been doing it by myself since the Sugar podcast. I've had some awesome guests by myself. I've had the Cozy Love Company. I've had Austin Mann, which was interesting, a local comedian here in Pensacola, who, if you've listened to the show, has grinded and grinded and grinded for years on the circuit here in the Southeast. So, What the Fuzz, that was cool too. Talking to, that guy, the satire podcast with him was cool. Or with that website was cool. These guys are funny, and that's the thing. They copied The Onion, but then they spun it, they spin it with their own little added, take to it. So I would highly suggest checking that podcast out, What the Fuzz. Of course, we've had Don and Susan Amari on the podcast. I had them. That was awesome. Dawn's a good friend of mine, and I'm so blessed every time I talk to her. And of course, Brent Hand. Can't forget about him from Hysteria 51. I got to talk to him. I mean, this has been a dream come true for me, to talk to people that I would never even have the chance to without this podcast. I got to talk about GTA with Stoy. And of course, catch up with my friend Mo Muscle, the MMA fighter. I mean, and I see this podcast as a way for me to express myself, as a way to entertain hundreds of people, hopefully this year. My goal is to get over 100, downloads per episode. That's the goal. Will I get there? I don't know, but that's the goal. Right now we're at 30 or so, and I started this Patreon page, and I'm hoping that people will start joining. So please consider it, and I have a lot of benefits ready to go. I'm just waiting for patrons, and it would highly, highly, highly help the podcast if you did join. I have a lot of different things planned. It'll just go right back into the podcast. The money I get will go right back into the podcast, making this production bigger and better. So that's the backstory on Sensibly Cynical. Frank and I just were hanging out in a coffee shop and said, yeah, let's do a podcast. Something I've been wanting to do for a while. So it's been amazing. I got to, talk to a lot of people about some interesting subjects. And more in the tank. I got more coming up. I'm talking to the Strip podcast about lacrosse. I'm talking to another Survivor player that I won't mention who it is yet. But, that's just a thrill for me. I'm a huge Survivor fan. And the fact that I can talk to Survivor players on my podcast, can't ask for anything better than that. So that is why I podcast, because I love it so much I can't stop. I just can't stop. Okay, that is it for this episode of Sensibly Cynical. If you could please subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes, it'd be highly appreciated. Also, check us out on Twitter at Cynical Sensibly, Instagram Sensibly Cynical Pod, and you can check out our Facebook group. Once again, thanks for listening. Take care.